So today we're talking about Gen13 by Brandon Choi, Jim Lee, J. Scott Campbell, and Alex Garner. Yes, Alex Garner. This is my first experience with a lot of these image books. I've read some more modern image stuff, but the only image stuff I had read previous to just a few months ago from this period was Spawn. I'd read some Spawn, and I'd maybe flipped through but not read some other stuff from that period. It's just not, has not been historically a big period of interest for me. I haven't had much reason to read it, honestly, but I was interested in going back and looking at some of these. So Gen13, I almost bought this at a Goodwill once. I looked at it, I flipped through it, it didn't sell me. So more recently, I did pay a few dollars for it, nothing much. The good thing about these early image trades is that there were so many of them, because they were so popular, that you can get them for relatively cheap, and nobody really cares. The sad thing about Gen13 and Wildcats here that we'll talk about later this week here on Image Week is that they were purchased by DC Comics when Jim Lee sold Wildstorm to DC Comics, and so they're not really going to be well treated going forward. They tried to integrate them into the greater DC universe with the New 52. The New 52 was a failure. Ultimately, continuity-wise, sales dipped off after that initial burst and leveled back out to DC levels to just, hopefully they'll learn their lesson, not to just randomly reboot stuff. But the point is, after that, they took these characters back out of the DC universe, and they really won't be a big part of any company's publishing because they're not that popular. To be honest with you, they're popular with some people who liked them in the 90s and maybe like the Warren Ellis stuff that he wrote, but we know what happened there. So, that being said, we're going to talk about this Gen13 thing. However, first of all, I want to clarify on the Savage Dragon. I had a lot of critical things to say about this, but compared to some of the other image stuff I have looked at recently, it was not entirely terrible. It was ultimately not my style of thing, and I want to contrast that with Gen13. Gen13 is far more my style. But in terms of the story and the type of story that it is, even though you see here some parents being murdered right in front of their children, that's a little dark. But it's the normal kind of superhero drama, right? Parents dying and the child then going on to become a superhero. That's kind of the standard. This art is by J. Scott Campbell. I believe I heard recently that he won a contest for Wildstorm, basically a comic book contest, and they hired him to do this stuff. When we looked at, I think this to the tale of two books here. When we looked at Savage Dragon, there was so much packed into essentially what was a little mini-series to introduce the character, introduce the overall tone of the series. And there was just so much in Savage Dragon that it ultimately was too much. In this one, you have a far more nuanced story. Like, Choi is not a terrible writer in terms of setup and payoff and everything. And so you get introduced to a singular character, that being here Miss Fairchild, Caitlin Fairchild. And she has got this roommate who is messy and she's neat. So I'm mad. One would imagine that was spelled out in the script. It'd be interesting to see scripts. That's why I like back matter. Like, when you can see a script versus breakdowns and finished pencils, and you can compare them all and see how they did and what the artist chose to do, and how they chose to change things up from what was written, and it's really interesting to me. But you can see that while her roommate's side of the room is completely messy, Caitlin Fairchild's side of the room much smaller. She's sort of meek and mild, and she's not going to be pushy or tell that person to clean up or, take up more of the space, and she's very neat. So we get an idea of what type of character she is. We also, here she is, she's got a long skirt on, she's got a sweater. This is the 90s, so we have 90s fashion. You can see the other female characters are wearing shorter garments, more revealing garments. And then we see her friend who is putting on her bra. Caitlin is clearly contrasted here. Form-fitting pants and shirt. And she's got these big glasses. She's clearly meant to be a little bit different from these other characters. She's in college. She's then recruited by a government organization to intern for them. And we get this like 90s exposition, a lot of introduction to the Gen13 program and what it is, and we'll get to that page in a bit. Pretty good overall. There's some weird images in this, but I think I like the art. It's sort of 90s fun. But this image here, I mean, just look at it. Just look at it. You have a woman sitting on a workout machine in, I don't know what kind of outfit this is, with a man in a background, no shirt, but he's got a tie on, he's got a bow tie on, and he's serving her a drink, and she's got these high-heeled boots on, and it's like, can you get more 90s than that? I just don't know. Honestly, I don't know. Even this, like, usually this angle can get messed up, but this is a good job of foreshortening and all of those perspective elements to make this look like a good image. So good on J. Scott Campbell. He started out really well. There's some weird stuff like this that looks kind of off, but that's okay. It was sort of the 90s excess time, and I think that's okay as long as the story reads. And overall, it reads pretty well. This was easy to get into, Gen 13. I read this, I think, in 1 or 2 sittings. I think I get interrupted by something important. So that's saying a lot, because some of this image stuff I've had to try to read a couple of times, just couldn't get into it, especially Wildcats, which we'll talk about later this week. But some of these times, these faces are a little long, a little flat, a little squished, I should say, not flat necessarily, but sort of like if you think about Woody the Cowboy, if you ever played with one of those toys, the big toys, you can squish his head in, the rubber head, or like the big G.I. Joes from the late 80s, early 90s period. You could squeeze their heads. It's almost like that, like you're squeezing it in a little bit. And so it can look a little odd. But it's not a criticism, it's a stylistic choice, I would suppose, mostly. And I don't know, maybe it's not. Maybe squished heads aren't a stylistic choice. But you do get introduced to these other characters that are going to be part of the Gen 13 team. And you can see even here, she's still meek and mild. And really, this is the story of her breaking out of that meekness and becoming assertive. And so she does. They get her powers sort of awakened. She has innate powers. And then you get this image here, which is like these super long legs. And you had to turn it sideways so you can get an idea of the scope of her clothing reveal here, or lack of clothing. I don't know that it was necessary. I'm not a big fan of these sideways pages. It makes for kind of an awkward reading experience, and especially double page spreads in a book like this, you can't quite see the whole thing. It's like, but I don't think they were thinking about trades back then. We then get a flash forward, I think, basically. Here, they're on the run outside of the place, and they start to fight, and then there's a lot of cool action. stuff happens. Then we get a flashback to after she gets her powers. Now, I was confused by some of this, to be honest with you. I didn't realize that she, like, got super tall. I was like, why are her legs so long? There was all these scenes where, like, I was like, man, he is all out of whack with who's tall. Like, why is she so tall? Why are her legs so long? Like, this especially, I was thrown off by, like, man, I've seen some Liefeld art, but that's ridiculous. Why are her legs so long? And it was sort of confusing to me. And so I was like, did I miss something? And I had to reread it and see, like, oh, she got taller. And her legs got a lot longer when her powers awakened. And that was like, oh, okay, I understand now. But that I did not get that in the first reading. It wasn't exactly clear. And because of the 90s style of exaggeration and perspective and anatomy all being off by a considerable amount at times, it didn't really register. And her legs are long here as well. Like, she's really a leggy person. And so once you get to this point with her growing taller, it was a little confusing. But that's okay. Let's skip some more pages here. Here's some, let's talk about the digital inking. Image sort of pushed on this digital inking for some of their books. We're doing this. It's interesting. It looks good for the most part when done right. Like, I think this is pretty good here. Just some small shading things, nothing too crazy. They weren't capable of that yet. And it gave them a different style of look, especially compared to the more flat colors from DC or Marvel. But a lot of times it can look kind of strange. Now, this book does pretty well. They get captured, and of course you get some shots of here without having to cover up here. You also get this little guy, and I like the cartooning that he does, that J. Scott Campbell does on children. It looks pretty good. Eventually, we're going to get here Pitt, which is another Image book that was coming out about that time, and he had a lot of crossovers, apparently. Yeah, pretty interesting stuff. We'll skip ahead here. Man, she teams up with Pitt. They fight people, and then all of the team comes together with powers, and they end up escaping. We get a little of the history of the different generation teams. Basically, Gen 13 is the 13th generation of this program to try to make superpowered individuals. And I don't want to spoil the whole thing. You guys can read it yourself if you'd like. Overall, this is probably my favorite of these old Image books I've read so far. I think that things were learned from Wildcats to this point. It's nice that Jim Lee was able to find J. Scott Campbell, get him a job, get him on a book like this where he could shine with younger female characters, especially. He's known for drawing, but just these younger characters, he really did do a pretty good job. It's not my favorite style of art, but it was pretty decent, I think. So where do we go from here with Gen 13? We've looked at Doug Tenable's Black Cherry. We've looked at the Savage Dragon. Later this week, we're going to look at Wildcats. I'm kind of limited on the Image books that I have, to be honest. I used to have some more, but I got rid of them. They weren't early Image books. They were later ones. And I just, basically I found a bunch at Goodwill. Like the Wicked and the Divine and stuff. And I was like, oh, this seems interesting. I read it and I was like, this is not for me. Not for me. So I got rid of that. But I don't really have that many Image books. So interestingly enough, next time on the Image Week, we're going to actually talk about a crowdfunded book that was published by Image. So this is by Justin Gray and Jimmy Palmiotti. This is from a number of years ago, and this is one of the first crowdfunded comic books I ever bought, and it's one of the first big ones that I ever knew of. So we'll definitely take a look at that later in the week. Oh, it's even signed by them and has a print, I think. Yeah. Pretty cool. Anyways, yeah, that should be interesting. And then, of course, later in the week, we'll look at Wildcats here on the first installment of Image Week. What are some other books that you guys are interested in seeing? Let me know what those are, where those might be, where I could find them. What did you guys think of Gen 13? Yeah, adios.